Hello everyone. In tonight's mystery, we present The Time It Rained Fish in Honduras, a bizarre weather phenomenon where fish reportedly fall from the sky during heavy storms documented for decades, yet still unexplained. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers, and tonight you'll hear it all. Now, lie back, listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. You wake up to the sound of your neighbor's rooster crowing with what can only be described as existential confusion. Even from your hotel room window in Honduras, you can tell something's different about this Tuesday morning. The air smells like fish, which would be perfectly normal if you were staying near the coast, but you're smack in the middle of the country, surrounded by mountains and coffee plantations. You pad to the window in your pajamas, the comfortable ones with the little coffee cups on them that your sister bought you for Christmas 3 years ago. Outside, the cobblestone streets glisten with morning dew and something else entirely. Small silver shapes catch the early sunlight, scattered across the plaza like someone had a very specific kind of confetti celebration. Mrs. Esperanza from the hotel front desk is already out there with a broom, muttering what you're pretty sure are some choice Spanish words you didn't learn in your high school textbook. She's sweeping fish, actual honest-to-goodness fish, into neat little piles along the sidewalk. You blink hard, wondering if the altitude is getting to you. You're here as part of a cultural exchange program, supposed to be documenting local folklore for your university back home, but this wasn't exactly the kind of folklore you had in mind. The fish are small, maybe 4 inches long, and definitely not the kind you'd expect to find flopping around a mountain town. They look suspiciously like sardines, which is odd because the nearest ocean is about 60 miles away, and these little guys didn't exactly walk here. You throw on yesterday's jeans and a t-shirt, the one that says, "I'd rather be reading," because honestly, you would, and head downstairs. The hotel lobby smells like coffee and confusion, with just a hint of that fishy aroma wafting in from outside. "Buenos dias," you say to Mrs. Esperanza, who's now back inside, looking like she's seen this particular brand of weirdness before. "Ah, you're awake," she says in perfect English, which always surprises you, even though she's been switching between languages all week. "I suppose you've noticed our little situation outside." You nod, trying to appear casual about the fact that it apparently rained seafood overnight. "So, this is normal?" She laughs, a warm sound that reminds you of your grandmother's chuckle when you'd ask particularly obvious questions as a kid. "Normal? No, mija, this is not normal. But it's not the first time either." That catches your attention. You pull out your notebook, the trusty leather-bound one that survived 3 research trips and countless coffee spills, and flip to a fresh page. "It's happened before?" "Oh yes, every few years, sometimes twice in 1 year if we're lucky. The townspeople call it lluvia de peces, the rain of fish, but nobody really knows why it happens." She hands you a cup of coffee that's strong enough to wake the dead and probably sweet enough to put them back to sleep. You take a sip and feel your brain start to function properly for the first time since waking up to the rooster's identity crisis. Has anyone ever tried to figure it out? Scientifically, I mean? Mrs. Esperanza shrugs, the kind of shrug that contains decades of experience with inexplicable events. Scientists come, they take their measurements, they scratch their heads, and they leave. The fish keep falling. You look out the window again. A small crowd has gathered in the plaza, mostly locals with buckets and baskets, collecting the fish like they're gathering berries. A few kids are darting between the adults, squealing with delight every time they spot a particularly shiny specimen. "What do people do with them?" you ask. "Cook them mostly. They're perfectly good fish. A little gift from the sky." She pauses, studying your face. "You're going to investigate this, aren't you? I can see that look in your eyes. It's the same look my nephew gets when he's trying to figure out how to get extra dessert." You grin, caught red-handed. "Well, I am here to study local mysteries." After breakfast, which notably did not include any of the mystery fish, despite Mrs. Esperanza's gentle suggestion, you decide to start your investigation the way any self-respecting amateur detective would, by wandering around and hoping something interesting happens. The plaza is bustling with activity. Vendors are setting up their stalls around the scattered fish, creating an oddly festive atmosphere. It's like a farmer's market. if farmers grew their produce in the sky and harvested it from cobblestones. You approach an elderly man who's carefully selecting fish with the concentration of someone choosing the perfect avocado. His weathered hands move quickly, sorting the catch into different containers with practiced efficiency. "Excuse me," you say in your carefully practiced Spanish. "Do you know why the fish fall?" He looks up with eyes that have probably seen more lluvia de peces than you've seen rainy days. "Señorita, I have lived here 73 years. I have seen the fish fall maybe 15 times. Each time people ask why. Each time the fish don't answer." Fair point. You make a note in your notebook. Fish surprisingly unhelpful with explanations. "But," he continues, warming to the subject, "my grandfather, he had a theory. He said the fish come when the town needs them most, during hard times, lean seasons, like a blessing." You glance around the plaza. The town doesn't look particularly prosperous, but it doesn't seem desperate either. Just normal. The kind of normal that apparently includes periodic fish precipitation. "When was the last time it happened?" 2 years ago, maybe 3. My memory isn't what it used to be, but my stomach remembers the taste. He pats his belly contentedly. Good eating, these little ones. Better than the fish in the market, that's for sure. You thank him and continue your rounds, interviewing anyone willing to talk. The stories you collect are as varied as the fish themselves. Some people insist it's weather-related, strong winds carrying the fish from distant waters. Others favor more supernatural explanations involving everything from blessed rain to disgruntled river spirits having a particularly generous day. One woman tells you her grandmother swore the fish only fell during months with an R in them, which you dutifully record even though you're pretty sure May doesn't qualify. Another insists it only happens when the moon is full, though a quick check of your phone reveals last night's moon was decidedly not full, more like a cosmic semicolon than a proper period. By noon, you've filled 6 pages with conflicting theories and have developed a healthy skepticism about eyewitness testimony. You've also acquired a mild sunburn and a growing appreciation for your sun hat, which you forgot to bring. The town's small library beckons from across the square, its faded sign promising air conditioning and possibly some answers. You push through the heavy wooden doors and immediately feel 20 degrees cooler. The librarian, a woman about your age with kind eyes and the sort of organizational skills you deeply envy, looks up from her desk. "Let me guess," she says in English with just a trace of an accent. "You'll hear about the fish. Is it that obvious?" You have that look, half excited, half confused, completely sunburned. Also, you're carrying a notebook and you keep glancing at the window like you expect more fish to fall at any moment. She's not wrong. You have been doing that. "I'm Rosa," she says, extending her hand. "And before you ask, yes, I've lived here my whole life. Yes, I've seen the fish fall many times. And no, I don't know why it happens, but I might know someone who does." Your pulse quickens. In mystery novels, this is usually where the librarian reveals the crucial piece of information that cracks the case wide open. "There's an old meteorologist who retired here about 10 years ago," Rosa continues. "American, like you. He's been obsessed with the fish rain ever since he arrived. Lives up in the hills with about 3,000 books and a weather station that would make NASA jealous." She jots down an address on a piece of paper. "Tell him Rosa sent you. And bring cookies. He has a weakness for anything with chocolate chips." The drive up to Dr. Marcus Whitfield's house is the kind that makes you grateful for rental car insurance and question your life choices. The road, and you're using the term road very generously here, winds through coffee plantations and patches of cloud forest like a drunk snake having an identity crisis. Your rental car, a cheerful yellow compact that seemed perfectly adequate in town, wheezes and complains with each switchback. By the time you reach the address Rosa gave you, you're convinced the car is planning to file a grievance with its union. The house sits on a ridge overlooking the valley, surrounded by more weather equipment than you've ever seen outside of a movie about tornadoes. Wind vanes spin lazily in the afternoon breeze, and various electronic devices blink and beep with the dedication of robots monitoring the apocalypse. Dr. Whitfield answers the door before you can knock, which is either very polite or slightly unnerving. He's exactly what you'd expect a retired meteorologist to look like. Wild grey hair that suggests frequent encounters with static electricity, weather-beaten skin, and eyes that seem to be constantly checking the sky for incoming phenomena. "You must be the folklore researcher," he says, ushering you inside. "Rosa called, said you'd have questions about our fishy precipitation." His living room looks like a library exploded in the best possible way. Books lie in every wall, stacked on every surface, with weather maps and charts filling the spaces between. It's the kind of organized chaos that would give a neat freak nightmares, but makes you feel oddly at home. "I brought cookies," you say, holding up the bag you picked up at a bakery in town. His eyes light up like a child spotting presents under the Christmas tree. "Chocolate chip?" "Of course." "Excellent. Can't solve meteorological mysteries on an empty stomach." He bustles around making coffee while you admire his collection of rain gauges. "So, what do you want to know about our little aquatic anomaly?" You pull out your notebook, now considerably thicker than it was this morning. "Everything, I guess. Is there a scientific explanation?" He settles into a worn leather chair with his coffee and a cookie. "Well, that depends on what you mean by scientific. There are theories, hypotheses, and educated guesses. But proof? That's trickier than catching the fish themselves." "What's your theory?" "Waterspouts," he says without hesitation. "Specifically, waterspouts that form over the Caribbean pick up schools of fish, carry them inland, and then deposit them here when atmospheric conditions are just right." It sounds plausible, which is somehow disappointing. You were secretly hoping for something more mysterious. "But here's the thing," he continues, apparently reading your expression. "I've been monitoring weather patterns here for a decade. I've got instruments that can detect atmospheric disturbances 3 days out. I've tracked every storm system, every pressure change, and every wind pattern between here and the coast." He pauses dramatically, taking a bite of cookie. And I've never detected a single waterspout strong enough to carry fish 60 miles inland. The atmospheric conditions required would be substantial. We're talking about weather systems that would make headlines, not just dropping off some sardines and disappearing quietly into the night. You feel that familiar tingle of a good mystery deepening. "So, what do you think is really happening?" Dr. Whitfield stands and walks to one of his weather maps, pointing to a series of red marks scattered around the Euro area. "These are all the documented fish falls I've been able to verify in the past 50 years. Notice anything?" You study the map, looking for patterns. The marks seem randomly scattered at first, but then something catches your eye. They're all in the same general area, like a target zone. Exactly. If it were waterspouts, you'd expect more random distribution, but these fish falls happen in a very specific geographic area, always within about a 15-mile radius. He returns to his chair, dunking another cookie in his coffee. "There's something else too. Something nobody talks about because it sounds crazy even by fish rain standards." Part 4. The Underground Connection. Approximately 680 words. Dr. Whitfield pulls out a thick folder from beneath a stack of meteorological journals. The folder is labeled Anomalous Precipitation Events in handwriting that suggests he takes his filing system very seriously indeed. "What I'm about to show you," he says, settling back into his chair with the air of someone about to reveal state secrets, "is the result of 10 years of very patient detective work, and possibly too much coffee." He spreads out several photographs on the coffee table. They're aerial shots of the area, marked with different colored pins and what looks like geological survey data. "Notice anything interesting about the topography?" he asks. You study the photos, trying to see whatever pattern he's obviously seeing. The landscape looks typically mountainous, with the usual complement of valleys, ridges, and winding rivers you'd expect in this part of Honduras. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for," you admit. "Caves," he says simply. "This entire region is honeycombed with limestone caves and underground river systems. Most of them haven't been properly mapped because, frankly, spelunking in Honduras isn't exactly a thriving tourist industry." He points to several spots on the map where small cave symbols are marked. "These are just the ones we know about. Local estimates suggest there could be hundreds more, creating an underground network that stretches all the way to the Caribbean coast. You're starting to see where this is heading, and it's wonderfully ridiculous. You think the fish are coming up through underground rivers? It would explain the geographic concentration, he says, warming to his theory. Underground rivers could carry fish inland through the limestone cave system. When conditions are right, maybe during heavy rains that raise water levels, the fish get pushed up through natural springs and sinkholes. It's certainly more creative than water spouts. You'll give him that. But there's a problem with that theory too, he continues, deflating your growing excitement. The fish that fall here are all saltwater species, sardines, anchovies, and sometimes small herring. But the underground rivers in this area are all freshwater systems. Saltwater fish wouldn't survive the journey. You make a note. Fish mysteriously surviving impossible journey through freshwater caves. Your notebook is starting to read like a rejected script for a nature documentary. Dr. Whitfield stands and walks to his window, gazing out at the valley below. I've been thinking about this puzzle for 10 years now. I've measured, recorded, analyzed, and hypothesized. I've consulted with marine biologists, geologists, and atmospheric physicists. And you know what conclusion I've reached? That meteorology is more complicated than it looks. He laughs. A sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. That some mysteries are bigger than their explanations. Maybe the real question isn't how the fish get here, but why we need them to. That's unexpectedly philosophical for a man surrounded by scientific instruments. What do you mean? Think about it, he says, returning to his chair. This town has been getting fish delivered from the sky for generations. Free protein, arriving precisely when it's needed most. It's like having a cosmic grocery delivery service with impeccable timing. You glance at your notes from this morning's interviews. Several people had mentioned that the fish always seemed to arrive during difficult times, lean seasons, economic hardships, and periods when the community could use a literal gift from above. You think it's intentional somehow? I think, he says carefully, that there are more things happening in this world than our instruments can measure. Sometimes the most important truths can't be quantified or categorized. They can only be witnessed and appreciated. He offers you another cookie, which you accept gratefully. Mystery solving is hungry work. There's someone else you should talk to, he says. Maria Santos, the town's unofficial historian. She's been collecting stories about the fish rain longer than anyone. Lives down near the old church, in the blue house with the garden that looks like it could house a small ecosystem. He scribbles down directions on the back of a weather map. Tell her I sent you, and ask her about the pattern. Maria Santos's garden is indeed spectacular, a riot of color and chaos that makes you wonder if she's secretly negotiating trade agreements with the local hummingbirds. Bougainvillea cascades over her fence like purple waterfalls, while herbs and vegetables create a maze that would challenge even the most determined GPS system. She's waiting for you on her front porch, a tiny woman with silver hair and eyes that sparkle with the kind of mischief usually reserved for people who know excellent secrets. A picture of something that looks refreshingly cold sits on a table between two rocking chairs, as if she's been expecting you all along. Doctor, Whitfield called, she says, by way of greeting, said you wanted to know about the pattern. You settle into the offered chair, accepting a glass of what turns out to be the most perfectly balanced lemonade you've ever tasted. It's sweet, tart, and somehow manages to taste like sunshine and patience combined. What pattern, you ask? Maria rocks gently, her chair creaking with the rhythm of someone who spent many afternoons in contemplation. The fish don't fall randomly, mija. They follow the stories. This is the kind of statement that would sound completely crazy in most contexts, but somehow, sitting in this garden with lemonade and the scent of jasmine in the air, it feels perfectly reasonable. What do you mean? My grandmother told me the stories, just as her grandmother told her. The fish have been falling on Euro for at least 200 years, maybe longer. Always in the same pattern, always following the same rules. She stands and disappears into the house, returning with a wooden box that looks old enough to have personal memories of the colonial period. Inside are dozens of handwritten journals, letters, and newspaper clippings, all carefully preserved and organized by date. I've been collecting these stories my whole life, she says, selecting a leather journal from the collection. Family histories, newspaper accounts, church records, every fish fall documented in this town for the past century and a half. She opens the journal to a page covered with neat handwriting and small sketches. Look at the dates. You study the entries, trying to find the pattern she's referring to. The fish falls seem to occur irregularly, sometimes twice in 1 year, sometimes with gaps of 3 or 4 years between events. I don't see it, you admit. Not the calendar dates, Maria says patiently. The story dates. Look at what was happening in the town each time the fish fell. She points to specific entries as she explains. 1943, the harvest failed, people were hungry. Fish fell 3 days after the priest led a prayer for divine assistance. 1952, the influenza outbreak left many families unable to work. Fish fell the morning after the town gathered to help the sick. 1967, the factory closed and unemployment was terrible. Fish fell during the town meeting where everyone was trying to figure out how to survive. As she continues through the entries, a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with weather systems or water spouts. The fish consistently arrive during moments of community crisis or unity, times when the town comes together to face difficulties or celebrate important events. It's like they're responding to something, you say, feeling slightly ridiculous for even suggesting it. Exactly, Maria nods approvingly. My grandmother used to say the fish could hear the prayers of the community, not individual prayers, but the collective voice of people united in purpose. She closes the journal and selects another, this one more recent. Yesterday's fishfall? It happened 12 hours after the town council announced they'd have to close the elementary school due to budget cuts. The whole community met in the plaza last evening, discussing what to do. The implications are fascinating and completely unscientific. You're documenting folklore, you remind yourself, not conducting a peer-reviewed study. But still, has anyone ever tested this theory? Maria laughs, a sound like silver bells in a gentle wind. How do you test a miracle, Misha? Some things are meant to be experienced, not explained. She refills your lemonade glass with practiced ease. But there's something else you should know. Something that might interest a researcher like yourself. Maria disappears into her house again, this time returning with a manila envelope that looks like it's seen better decades. She handles it with the careful reverence usually reserved for fragile antiques or sleeping babies. This came to me about 5 years ago, she says, settling back into her rocking chair. From a marine biology professor at the university in Tegucigalpa. She'd heard about our fish rain and wanted to study it. She pulls out several official-looking documents and photographs. Dr. Alejandra Vasquez. She spent 6 months here, collecting samples every time fish fell. Ran all sorts of tests, DNA analysis, species identification, age determination, the works. You lean forward, your researcher instincts tingling. This is the kind of scientific data that could either solve the mystery or make it infinitely more puzzling. What did she find? Maria sorts through the papers with deliberate slowness, building suspense like a master storyteller. The fish are exactly what they appear to be. Common sardines and anchovies, species found throughout the Caribbean. Nothing unusual about that. She pauses, selecting a specific document. But here's the interesting part. According to her analysis, all the fish that fall here, regardless of which year they fell, are exactly the same age, down to the week. That's odd. You make a note, though you're not entirely sure what it means. There's more, Maria continues. The DNA analysis showed something even stranger. The fish don't come from just any Caribbean population. They come from one very specific location, a small region off the coast near La Ceiba, about 60 miles northeast of here. She hands you a photograph of what looks like an underwater landscape. This is where it gets truly mysterious. Dr. Vasquez traced the DNA markers to a particular reef system, but when she sent divers to investigate the area, they found something unexpected. The photograph shows an underwater cave system, its entrance partially hidden by coral formations. It looks ancient and unexplored, the kind of place that might house sea monsters, or at least some very interesting fish populations. The cave system extends much further inland than anyone realized, Maria explains. The divers followed it for nearly 2 miles before they had to turn back. It connects to the same limestone formations that Dr. Whitfield showed you, the underground river system that runs all through this region. You're starting to see the pieces of the puzzle, though they still don't quite fit together. So the fish could theoretically travel underground from the coast? That's what Dr. Vasquez thought initially, but there's a problem with that theory too. Maria pulls out another document, this one covered with scientific charts and graphs. The fish that fall here are all caught at exactly the same stage of development, young adults about 6 months old, but the journey through the underground system would take weeks, maybe months. The fish would age during the trip. She rocks gently, letting you process this information. Dr. Vasquez concluded that either the fish are making the journey impossibly quickly, or she trails off meaningfully. Or what? Or they're not making the journey at all. They're appearing here through some mechanism we don't understand yet. The garden seems quieter now, as if even the birds are pondering the implications. You sip your lemonade and try to wrap your head around the idea of teleporting fish. What happened to Dr. Vasquez? Did she publish her findings? Maria's expression grows thoughtful. She was supposed to return last year with better equipment and more funding, but then she disappeared. Disappeared? Not dramatically, Maria clarifies quickly, seeing your expression. She simply stopped responding to emails and phone calls. The university said she'd taken a leave of absence for personal reasons, but her research assistant told me she'd been talking about coming back to explore the cave system more thoroughly. She carefully returns the documents to their envelope. Which brings me to why I wanted to talk with you, Mija. Dr. Vasquez left some equipment here, underwater cameras, diving gear, and research materials. She asked me to keep them safe until she returned. Maria looks directly at you, her eyes twinkling with unmistakable invitation. I don't suppose a folklore researcher would be interested in a little underwater exploration? 3 days later, you find yourself wearing a wetsuit that's slightly too large and wondering how exactly you went from documenting folklore to preparing for what amounts to amateur cave diving. Dr. Whitfield has volunteered to be your surface support, which is reassuring since his weather monitoring equipment can presumably detect if you're about to be eaten by whatever lives in underwater caves. The entrance to the cave system is about a 30-minute hike from town, hidden in a grove of cecropia trees near a natural spring. The water is crystal clear and surprisingly warm, fed by underground sources that maintain a constant temperature year-round. According to Dr. Vasquez's notes, you say, adjusting your underwater camera, the cave system extends northeast toward the coast, following the limestone formations. She documented about 2 miles of passages before turning back. Dr. Whitfield checks his radio equipment one final time. Remember, you're not trying to solve the entire mystery today. Just see what you can see, document what you find, and come back safely. The fish will still be falling whether or not we understand why. The water is deeper than you expected, dropping quickly from the shallow spring into a proper underground river. Your waterproof flashlight illuminates smooth limestone walls carved by centuries of flowing water. Fish dart through the beam, small freshwater species that belong here, unlike their mysterious saltwater cousins that occasionally fall from the sky. You follow the main passage, taking photographs and checking your compass regularly. The cave system is remarkably extensive, branching into side passages that disappear into darkness beyond the reach of your light. After about 20 minutes of slow swimming, you reach what Dr. Vasquez's notes described as the anomaly. The passage opens into a large underwater chamber, its ceiling rising well above the water level. But what catches your attention isn't the size, it's the light. A soft blue-green glow emanates from somewhere deeper in the chamber, too steady and pure to be natural bioluminescence. You surface in an air pocket and find yourself in what can only be described as an underwater cathedral. Limestone formations create natural columns and arches, and the mysterious light transforms everything into an aquatic dreamscape. But the most remarkable thing is the sound, or rather the lack of it. The chamber is filled with a profound silence that seems to muffle even your breathing. Swimming toward the light source, you discover something that makes you forget every scientific explanation you've heard in the past week. The glow comes from a circular pool in the chamber floor, perfectly round and about 10 feet in diameter. The water in the pool is moving differently than the surrounding cave water, swirling in slow, hypnotic spirals that seem to follow their own physics. You photograph everything, though you suspect the images won't capture the strange quality of the light or the mesmerizing movement of the water. As you're adjusting your camera settings, something extraordinary happens. Fish begin appearing in the glowing pool, not swimming in from another passage, simply materializing in the spiraling water as if they're stepping through an invisible doorway. Sardines and anchovies, exactly the species that fall on Euro, swimming in confused circles before being caught by the current and swept toward the cave entrance. You watch, transfixed, as dozens of fish make this impossible journey from wherever they come from to wherever they're going. The process is silent, gentle, and completely inexplicable. After about 10 minutes, the glowing fades, the spiraling slows, and the chamber returns to normal cave darkness. You take several more photographs, though you already know they'll probably show nothing more than limestone and water. Some things, as Dr. Whitfield suggested, are bigger than their explanations. The swim back to the entrance feels different now, charged with the knowledge that you've witnessed something that will never fit neatly into a research paper or folklore collection. When you finally surface in the spring, Dr. Whitfield takes one look at your face and starts packing his equipment without asking questions. That evening, sitting on Mrs. Esperanza's hotel porch with a cup of coffee and your damp notebook, you realize that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. The fish will continue falling on Euro, the townspeople will continue gathering them gratefully, and somewhere in an underwater chamber, the impossible will continue happening quietly, patiently, and without need for human understanding. Sometimes the most profound truths are the simplest ones. The world is far more wondrous than we imagine, and that's exactly as it should be. The end. Picture this. You're settling into your favorite reading chair on a September evening in 1983. The world outside feels perfectly ordinary. Somewhere, people are watching Cheers on television, kids are trading baseball cards, and your neighbor is probably still trying to figure out how to program that newfangled VCR. But 40 miles south of Moscow, in a bunker that looks like it was designed by someone who thought comfort was a dirty word, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is about to have the worst night shift of his life. You know those nights when everything that can go wrong does? Well, imagine that feeling, but instead of your coffee maker breaking and your car not starting, the stakes involve every living thing on the planet. Petrov is sitting in front of a console that looks like something from a science fiction movie. All blinking lights and serious looking buttons that you'd be terrified to accidentally lean against. The OCO early warning system stretches across the Soviet Union like an electronic spiderweb, its satellites perched in space with one job: watch for American missiles. It's 1983, and the Cold War isn't just cold, it's practically Arctic. President Reagan has been referring to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, a characterization as diplomatic as calling your mother-in-law's cooking interesting. Meanwhile, the Soviets are convinced the Americans are planning a first strike, possibly disguised as a military exercise. Petrov isn't your typical military officer. While his colleagues tend to see the world in stark black and white, he views it more like a complicated jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces might be from different boxes entirely. Tonight, he's the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a facility so secret that it doesn't officially exist. You could drive past it and think it's just another unremarkable Soviet concrete building, which is precisely the point. The evening starts quietly enough. Petrov reviews reports, checks systems, and probably wishes he'd brought a thermos of something stronger than tea. The bunker hums with the white noise of electronics and ventilation systems, creating that particular kind of institutional quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. But here's where our story takes its first unsettling turn. At 12:15 a.m. on September the 26th, the early warning system decides to have what you might politely call a moment. Red lights begin flashing with the urgent persistence of a smoke detector with a dying battery, except the alarm isn't alerting you to burned toast. It's announcing that 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles are heading towards Soviet soil. In the Hollywood version of this story, there would be dramatic music, people shouting, and someone would definitely spill coffee on something important. But reality is quieter and somehow more terrifying. The computer screen displays the information with bureaucratic efficiency, indicating that incoming missiles have been detected, launch sites identified, impact time is calculated. Have a lovely day. Petrov stares at the screen, and you can imagine his thoughts racing like a hamster on an espresso bender. Protocol is crystal clear in situations like this. Report the attack immediately to Soviet command, who would then have perhaps 20 minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. It's not a decision you want to make before you've had your morning coffee, except it's past midnight and morning feels very far away. The weight of the moment settles around him like a heavy blanket. This isn't a drill, and there's no do-over if he gets it wrong. Pick up that red phone and you've potentially started World War III. Don't pick it up, and you might have just let your country get destroyed without warning anyone. It's the kind of choice that makes deciding what to have for lunch seem refreshingly simple. Now, it's crucial to imagine yourself in Petrov's shoes, which likely weren't the most comfortable ones to begin with. You're looking at a computer screen that's essentially telling you that Armageddon has begun, and you have minutes, not hours, not days, but minutes, to decide what to do about it. It's like being asked to choose between chocolate and vanilla ice cream, except one flavor might accidentally end civilization. But Petrov has something that saves the world, a beautifully stubborn streak of skepticism. While the computer insists that 5 missiles are inbound, his mind starts picking apart the scenario like a detective examining a crime scene. 5 missiles? Really? If the Americans were actually launching a first strike, wouldn't they send everything they had? 5 missiles would be like trying to knock down a brick wall with a handful of pebbles. Technically possible, but probably not the strategy you choose if you really meant business. You see, Petrov understands something that the computer doesn't: context. The early warning system is brilliant at detecting heat signatures and trajectory calculations, but it's terrible at understanding human nature. It can tell you what appears to be happening, but it can't tell you whether it actually makes sense. The minutes tick by, like hours. Somewhere above, those satellites are faithfully reporting data, completely unaware that they might be triggering the end of the world over what could be a cosmic misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Petrov is doing something that computers can't. He's thinking about the bigger picture. He considers the geopolitical situation like someone examining a complicated recipe. The Americans, for all their bellicose rhetoric, haven't shown signs of preparing for an actual nuclear exchange. Their military exercises, while provocative, have followed predictable patterns. And if you were really planning to start a nuclear war, you probably wouldn't begin with just 5 missiles when you had thousands available. It would be like deciding to redecorate your living room by painting only one wall. But doubt is a tricky companion at moments like this. What if he's wrong? What if this really is the opening salvo of an American attack, and his skepticism is about to cost his country its only chance to respond? The weight of potentially millions of lives presses down on his shoulders like the world's most uncomfortable backpack. The fascinating thing about this moment is how ordinary it feels from Petrov's perspective. There's no dramatic music, no cinematic tension, just a man in a concrete bunker looking at flashing lights, trying to decide whether the world is actually ending. It's a bureaucratic apocalypse, which somehow feels more frightening than the Hollywood version. Other officers in the facility are looking at him expectantly. They can see the same warnings he can, and they're waiting for him to follow protocol. The red telephone sits there like an invitation to disaster. One call, and the Soviet nuclear arsenal would begin its deadly countdown. the machinery of mutually assured destruction would grind into motion and there would be no taking it back. But Petrov does something remarkable. He chooses to trust his instincts over his technology. In an age when we're constantly told that computers are smarter than humans, that data doesn't lie, and that machines are more reliable than intuition, he decides that sometimes human judgment trumps electronic certainty. He doesn't pick up the phone. Instead, he reports the incident as a system malfunction. The incident is classified as a false alarm based on his assessment of the situation, although it has not been proven or confirmed. It's the kind of decision that either makes you a hero or has you court-martialed, with very little middle ground between those two outcomes. The clock continues its relentless advance and the missile impact time approaches. If Petrov is wrong, Soviet cities are about to be destroyed, and his refusal to report the attack will go down in history as one of the most catastrophic errors in human judgment. If he's right, well, nothing will happen, which is sometimes the most beautiful outcome imaginable. You know that feeling when you're waiting for important news, maybe test results from the doctor, or whether you got that job, or if your teenager made it home safely. That suspended animation where time seems to move like honey in winter, that's where Petrov finds himself, except the stakes are slightly higher than usual. He's essentially betting the world that his gut feeling is more accurate than a multi-million-dollar early warning system. The beautiful irony of this situation is that if Petrov is right, nothing dramatic will happen. The missiles won't arrive, the world won't end, and most people will never know how close they came to a very bad day. Success in this case looks exactly like an ordinary night where nothing interesting happens. It's like being a smoke detector. You're only noticed when things go wrong. Meanwhile, the Oko system continues its electronic insistence that doom is imminent. The satellites don't have the luxury of doubt. They're designed to report what they see, not to philosophize about it. From their perspective, 40,000 miles above Earth, they've detected heat signatures and trajectory patterns that match their programming for incoming ballistic missiles. They're doing their job perfectly, which is exactly the problem. But here's something wonderful about human nature. We're remarkably good at pattern recognition when we let ourselves think instead of just react. Petrov's brain is working like a master detective, examining not just the immediate evidence, but the broader context. Why would the Americans attack with such a small number of missiles? Why now? Why this particular configuration? It's like looking at a painting and noticing that while all the technical elements are correct, something about the composition feels wrong. The brushstrokes are right, the colors are accurate, but the overall picture doesn't make sense. Petrov is seeing past the technical data to the human logic underneath, and that logic is telling him something important. This doesn't feel like how a real nuclear attack would begin. The minutes crawl by with the enthusiasm of a reluctant student heading to detention. If those missiles are real, they should be showing up on ground-based radar systems soon. But as the projected impact time approaches, something beautiful happens. Nothing. No secondary confirmations, no radar contacts, no mushroom clouds on the horizon. Just the same ordinary September night that was quietly minding its own business before the computers decided to panic. You can imagine the relief washing over Petrov like warm water after a cold shower. His instincts were right. The early warning system, for all its technological sophistication, had essentially cried wolf, or in this case, cried nuclear war, which is considerably more serious than a wolf but follows the same basic principle of false alarms causing unnecessary panic. But the story doesn't end there, because now comes the part that often gets overlooked in dramatic retellings, the aftermath. Petrov has to explain to his superiors why he chose not to report what the computer said was an incoming nuclear attack. This is like trying to explain to your boss why you decided not to evacuate the building when the fire alarm went off, except the building is an entire country and the fire alarm costs more than most people's houses. The investigation that follows is thorough and probably not particularly fun for Petrov. Military bureaucracies are not known for their appreciation of freelance thinking, especially when it comes to nuclear warfare protocols. You don't just ignore early warning systems because you have a hunch, at least not without filling out a considerable amount of paperwork afterward. But here's the thing about being right in a spectacular way. It tends to vindicate even the most unconventional decision-making. The technical analysis eventually confirms what Petrov's instincts told him that night. The satellites had misidentified sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds as the heat signatures of missile launches. It was a cosmic case of mistaken identity, like thinking your neighbor's garden hose is a snake. Now, you might expect that someone who single-handedly prevented World War III would become an instant celebrity, maybe get a parade, and certainly earn a spot in the history books. But you'd be forgetting something important about the Soviet Union in 1983. They weren't exactly in the business of advertising their technological failures, especially when those failures nearly triggered nuclear Armageddon. Instead of becoming a hero, Petrov finds himself in the peculiar position of being the man who saved the world and can't tell anyone about it. It's like performing the most important magic trick in history and then being sworn to secrecy about how it was done. The Soviet military, understandably embarrassed that their expensive early warning system had confused clouds with missiles, decided that the less said about the entire incident, the better. This is where the story takes on an almost surreal quality. Petrov goes back to his regular duties, probably gets his regular paychecks, and continues living his life while carrying the knowledge that he once held the fate of human civilization in his hands. It's the ultimate example of carrying your work stress home with you. The fascinating thing about this period is how normal everything feels. The world continues spinning, people go about their daily lives, and nobody knows how close they came to a very different kind of morning on September 26th. It's like learning that your morning commute regularly takes you past a dormant volcano. Technically, nothing has changed, but somehow everything feels different once you know. Petrov's colleagues at the facility are aware of what happened, of course, but they're bound by the same secrecy requirements. Imagine having the most interesting story in the world and not being allowed to tell it at parties. It would be like winning the lottery and having to pretend you're still worried about your electric bill. But secrets have a way of eventually surfacing, like corks in water. The story begins to leak out through various channels. Military historians, investigative journalists, and former Soviet officials who feel more talkative after the Cold War ends. Each telling adds new details, new perspectives, and new appreciation for just how close humanity came to accidentally destroying itself over a meteorological misunderstanding. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of a man who was remarkably well suited for his impossible moment in history. Petrov wasn't a maverick or a rebel. He was simply someone who understood that sophisticated technology is only as good as the human judgment that interprets it. He had the rare combination of technical knowledge and common sense that allowed him to see past the flashing lights to the bigger picture. The more you learn about that night, the more you realize how many things had to go right for the story to end well. Petrov had to be the duty officer. Someone else might have followed protocol without question. The false alarm had to be ambiguous enough to allow for doubt. A more convincing fake attack might not have triggered his skepticism. And perhaps, most importantly, the geopolitical situation had to be stable enough that taking 20 minutes to think didn't cost everything. It's humbling to realize how much of human survival can depend on individual moments of good judgment. We like to think that our systems are foolproof, that our safeguards are redundant, and that catastrophe is prevented by institutional wisdom rather than individual insight. But sometimes it comes down to one person in a bunker, looking at flashing lights and deciding to trust their instincts over their instructions. The story of that September night is ultimately about the irreplaceable value of human judgment in an automated world. Computers can process information faster than humans. Satellites can detect heat signatures from thousands of miles away. And early warning systems can calculate missile trajectories with mathematical precision. But they can't do the one thing that saved the world that night. They can't step back, look at the bigger picture and say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. You know how sometimes the most important events are the ones that don't happen? Like when you almost get into a car accident but don't, or when you nearly say something you'd regret but catch yourself just in time. The night of September 26, 1983, is one of those non-events that changed everything precisely because it remained a non-event. The beautiful thing about disasters that don't occur is that life continues with blissful ignorance of what might have been. People wake up the next morning, complain about their coffee being too cold or too hot, and worry about perfectly normal things like mortgage payments and whether their kids are doing their homework. The world keeps spinning, completely unaware that it almost didn't. But in the shadowy world of nuclear strategy and Cold War politics, Petrov's decision sends ripples that spread far beyond that concrete bunker outside Moscow. The incident becomes a case study, though a classified one, in the limitations of automated systems and the continuing importance of human oversight. Military strategists on both sides of the Iron Curtain begin asking uncomfortable questions about their own early warning systems. What if this had happened to American computers? What if the false alarm had been more convincing? What if the duty officer had been someone less inclined to question the technology? These questions don't have comfortable answers, which is precisely why they need to be asked. The technical investigation into the false alarm demonstrates the ease with which a combination of circumstances can fool sophisticated systems. The combination of sunlight, clouds, satellite positioning, and computer algorithms resembled an incoming missile attack to electronic eyes. It was like a perfect storm, except instead of rain and wind, it was photons and software creating the potential for nuclear winter. This discovery leads to improvements in the ecosystem, better training for operators, and more robust procedures for verifying alerts. But it also highlights a fundamental truth about the nuclear age. No system is perfect, and the margin for error in nuclear warfare is essentially zero. You cannot partially launch a nuclear missile, start World War III in a limited way, or nearly destroy civilization. These are binary choices with permanent consequences. The incident also becomes a quiet catalyst for broader discussions about nuclear strategy. Not immediately, of course. In 1983, both superpowers are still deeply committed to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. However, the close call raises questions about the effectiveness of highly sensitive alert systems and automated reactions to possible dangers. Think about the psychological weight that Petrov carries after that night. He knows something that almost nobody else knows, how fragile the peace really is, how easily a software glitch or a meteorological anomaly can bring two superpowers to the brink of nuclear exchange. It's like being the only person who knows that the bridge everyone drives across every day is held up by a single bolt that's working loose. Years later, when the Cold War begins to fall and people start talking more openly about close calls and near misses, Petrov's story takes on almost mythical qualities. Here was a moment when the entire trajectory of human history pivoted on one person's decision to think rather than react, to question rather than comply, and to trust human judgment over mechanical certainty. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Petrov is how he handles the knowledge of what he did. There's no swagger, no sense of self-importance, and no demand for recognition. He simply did his job as he understood it, made the best decision he could with the information available, and then got on with his life. It's the kind of quiet heroism that doesn't make for dramatic movies, but represents the best of human nature. The story also serves as a reminder that the Cold War, for all its grand strategies and elaborate theories, ultimately came down to individual human beings making decisions under pressure. All the sophisticated technology, all the careful planning, and all the military doctrine in the world couldn't eliminate the need for someone to look at a situation and decide what it actually meant. The peculiar thing about preventing the end of the world is that it doesn't feel like much of an accomplishment at the time. There's no medal ceremony for disasters that don't happen, no parade for catastrophes avoided, and no Nobel Prize for best use of common sense in a nuclear crisis. Petrov goes back to his regular life, carrying the weight of what he knows but unable to share it with anyone who wasn't there. This phase is where the story becomes almost absurdly normal. The man who saved civilization goes home to his apartment, probably watches television, and maybe argues with his neighbors about parking spaces. He continues his military service, deals with the bureaucracy of the Soviet system, and lives the kind of ordinary life that's only possible because extraordinary disaster was averted. However, Secrets, particularly significant ones, have a tendency to demand disclosure. As the years pass and the Cold War machinery begins to creak and eventually collapse, the story of that September night starts to emerge from the classified shadows. Military historians piece together accounts, former Soviet officials become more talkative, and gradually the world learns about the night it almost ended. When Petrov's story finally becomes public, the reaction is fascinating. People struggle to comprehend how close humanity came to accidental self-destruction. It's like learning that you've been walking across a tightrope without realizing it. Technically, nothing has changed, but your perspective on everything is suddenly different. The story serves as a compelling argument for nuclear disarmament, but not in the way you might anticipate. It's not the horror of nuclear weapons that moves people, but the absurdity of the situation. The idea that a computer glitch and some oddly positioned clouds could have triggered World War III makes the entire nuclear standoff seem less like strategic deterrence and more like an elaborate game of Russian roulette with the entire planet. Petrov himself becomes something of a reluctant celebrity in his later years. He conducts interviews, accepts awards, and speaks at conferences about nuclear policy, but he always maintains a kind of bemused detachment from his role as the man who saved the world. To him, he was simply doing his job, making the best decision he could with the information available. The fact that this decision happened to prevent global catastrophe was, in his view, almost incidental. This perspective is both refreshing and slightly unsettling. We want our heroes to be heroic, to understand the magnitude of their actions, and to carry themselves with the weight of their accomplishments. But Petrov's ordinariness is precisely what made him effective that night. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he was trying to be right. The story also raises uncomfortable questions about how many other close calls there might have been, and how many other Petrovs have made similar decisions without the world ever learning about them. The nuclear age is full of incidents that were classified, buried, or simply never reported. Each represents a moment when human judgment stood between ordinary life and extraordinary catastrophe. Perhaps most importantly, Petrov's story serves as a reminder that the most crucial decisions are often made not by presidents or generals, but by individuals in the right place at the right time with the courage to trust their instincts. History is shaped not just by grand strategies and sweeping movements, but with quiet moments when someone looks at a flashing computer screen and decides to think before acting. The man who prevented nuclear war by refusing to panic becomes, in his quiet way, a symbol of everything that's best about human nature under pressure. This is not the dramatic heroism of action movies, but the thoughtful heroism of taking a breath, considering the options, and choosing wisdom over protocol when the two conflict. And so we come to the end of our story, though of course it's not really an ending. It's more like the moment when you realize that what seemed like thrilling mystery was actually a meditation on the nature of courage, judgment, and the strange ways that history unfolds. Stanislav Petrov lived until 2017, long enough to see the Cold War become a historical curiosity, to watch his story become known around the world, and to receive recognition for his role in preserving human civilization. But by most accounts, he remained remarkably unchanged by his brush with global significance. He was, to the end, simply a man who had done his job well at a crucial moment. The lesson of that September night isn't really about nuclear weapons or Cold War politics, though those are certainly part of the story. It's about the irreplaceable value of human judgment in an increasingly automated world. It's about the importance of maintaining the ability to step back from the immediate crisis and ask the larger question: does this situation make sense? In our current age of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making, Petrov's story feels particularly relevant. We're constantly being told that computers are smarter than humans, that data doesn't lie, and that machine learning can solve problems better than human intuition. And in many cases, this is true. But on that night in 1983, human intuition saved the world precisely because it could do something that computers couldn't. It could doubt. The most important decision in human history was made by someone trying to be careful, not someone trying to be important. Petrov's goal was not to become a hero, but to prevent a mistake. From his perspective, avoiding this particular mistake was almost beside the point, even though it saved every living thing on Earth. This fact is perhaps the most comforting aspect of the entire story. The world wasn't saved by superhuman wisdom or extraordinary courage, but by ordinary human judgment applied thoughtfully under pressure. It suggests that most of us, faced with similar circumstances, might be capable of comparable clarity. The heroism wasn't in being special, but in being sensible. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might gain comfort in knowing that somewhere out there, in control rooms and command centers around the world, there are people like Petrov, individuals who understand that the most sophisticated technology is only as beneficial as the human wisdom that guides it. These individuals understand that sometimes the most important action is to take a breath, look at the bigger picture, and trust your instincts. The night the world almost ended turned out to be just another night, which is precisely how it should be. The missiles that weren't there didn't arrive, the war that wasn't starting didn't begin, and humanity continued its long, complicated, often absurd journey through history, all because one person in a bunker outside Moscow decided to think before acting, to question before reacting, and to trust human judgment over electronic certainty. And perhaps that's the most beautiful mystery of all, how often the most extraordinary outcomes arise from the most ordinary virtues. The world was saved not by heroes, but by someone doing his job carefully. The world was saved not by dramatic action, but by thoughtful inaction. It was not someone who sought to alter the course of history, but rather someone who merely aimed to achieve accuracy. Sleep well, knowing that sometimes the most decisive victories are the ones that look like nothing happened at all. Occasionally, the greatest courage is simply the wisdom to pause, think, and choose understanding over urgency. And sometimes saving the world is as simple as trusting that 5 missiles don't make sense when you could send 500. The night the world almost ended was, in the end, just another night. How the best ending should be. So quiet and ordinary that you almost don't notice them happening.
Passengers slept in their cabins on the night of April 14th, 1912. 5 men worked tirelessly in the belly of the Titanic, surrounded by 3,423 sacks of mail destined for New York. The ship's postal clerks, John Starr March, William Logan Gwynn, Oscar Scott Woody, John Richard Jago Smith and James Bertram Williamson, represented an international crew from America, Britain and Belgium, united by their dedication to the Royal Mail Service and the United States Postal Service. When the collision occurred at 11:40 p.m, these men didn't panic or abandon their post. Instead, they made a decision that would define their final hours. They would save as much mail as possible. Water began flooding the mailroom within minutes of impact, rising rapidly through the lower decks. The postal workers immediately began hauling mail sacks from the flooding G deck to the drier F deck, working by lamplight as the ship's power flickered uncertainly. What many don't realise is that these weren't just letters and packages. The mail carried irreplaceable documents, business contracts, immigration papers, and personal correspondence that represented lifelines for families separated by the Atlantic. The postal workers understood that each sack contained someone's hope, someone's future, and someone's connection to loved ones across the ocean. As the water continued to rise, the 5 men worked with methodical precision. They had trained for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of a sinking ship. The mailroom's location near the front of the vessel meant they were among the first to experience the full force of the flooding. Yet witness accounts from survivors indicate they continued working even as water reached their waists. John March, the chief postal clerk, had sailed on numerous Atlantic crossings and was respected by crew members for his calm demeanour under pressure. That night, he guided his team with the unwavering professionalism that characterised his entire career. The men worked in assembly line fashion, passing sacks from hand to hand, their movements becoming increasingly frantic as the water level rose. By midnight, the situation had become desperate. The postal workers had managed to relocate hundreds of mail sacks to higher decks, but the flooding was accelerating. The mailroom's electric lights had failed, leaving them to work by the dim glow of emergency lighting. Still, they persisted, driven by a sense of duty that transcended personal safety. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the water had risen to chest level in the mailroom. Despite acknowledging the loss of their battle, the 5 men remained unwavering in their dedication. Instead of immediately seeking lifeboats, they made one final effort to secure what mail they could in waterproof containers, hoping that some might survive even if they did not. The last confirmed sighting of the postal workers came at 1:30 a.m., just over an hour before the ship's final plunge. A surviving crew member reported seeing them still working on F-deck, now waist-deep in water, methodically securing mail sacks with rope and canvas. Their faces, illuminated by flickering emergency lights, showed exhaustion but not defeat. None of the 5 postal workers survived the disaster. Their bodies were never recovered, claimed by the same Atlantic waters that swallowed their carefully tended mail. However, their sacrifice wasn't entirely in vain. Several mail sacks were found floating in the debris field and were later recovered by rescue ships. Some letters, sealed in waterproof pouches, reached their intended recipients weeks later, bearing water stains that told their story of that terrible night. The postal workers' dedication became a symbol of professional honour and personal sacrifice. In an era when mail service was the primary means of long-distance communication, these 5 men understood that their work connected families, enabled commerce, and maintained the bonds that held communities together across vast distances. Their decision to prioritize duty over personal safety reflected values that defined their generation, values that would be tested again and again in the turbulent decades that followed. The story of the Titanic's band has been told countless times, but the deeper narrative of how music functioned as both comfort and communication during the disaster reveals layers of human psychology often overlooked. The 8 musicians aboard the ship, led by band leader Wallace Hartley, represented more than entertainment. They embodied the sophisticated cultural aspirations of Edwardian society and the belief that civilization could triumph over chaos through art and refinement. Wallace Hartley, a 33-year-old from Yorkshire, had assembled his ensemble with meticulous care. Each musician brought unique skills and backgrounds that reflected the international nature of the ship's passenger list. The band included violinists, cellists and pianists who performed in some of Europe's finest hotels and concert halls. They weren't merely ship's entertainers, but accomplished artists who had chosen maritime work for its steady income and opportunities to travel. What made their final performance extraordinary wasn't just their decision to keep playing, but their sophisticated understanding of music's psychological impact. As the ship listed and panic spread, Hartley made calculated choices about repertoire. The band initially played upbeat ragtime numbers and popular songs to maintain normalcy and prevent mass hysteria. They understood that familiar melodies could provide psychological anchors in a situation where reality had become incomprehensible. The musicians positioned themselves strategically on the boat deck, where their music could reach the maximum number of passengers. Their location wasn't accidental. Hartley had studied the ship's acoustics during the voyage and knew exactly where sound would carry most effectively. As lifeboats were lowered, the band's music provided a sonic backdrop that helped maintain order during the evacuation process. Survivor testimonies reveal that the band's music evolved throughout the night, reflecting the changing psychology of the disaster. As the situation became increasingly desperate, Hartley transitioned from popular entertainment to hymns and classical pieces. This shift wasn't random, but represented a deliberate attempt to provide spiritual comfort as hope for survival diminished. The choice of "Nearer, My God, to Thee" as their final selection has been debated for over a century, but multiple survivors confirmed hearing hymns during the ship's final minutes. What's remarkable is that the musicians continued playing even as the deck tilted at increasingly severe angles, making it physically difficult to maintain their instruments and their balance. Their commitment transcended mere professionalism. It became an act of defiance against the chaos surrounding them. The band's performance also served a practical purpose that historians often overlook. Their music masked the sounds of the ship's death throes, the groaning of metal, the rushing of water, and the mechanical failures that accompanied the sinking. By providing an alternative auditory focus, they helped prevent the complete psychological breakdown that might have occurred if passengers had been forced to listen only to the ship's destruction. Each musician made a personal choice to remain with the band rather than seek survival, Roger Brousseau, the young French cellist, had written to his family about his excitement for the voyage. Percy Taylor, the pianist, had planned to marry his fiancée upon returning to London. These men sacrificed their individual futures for what they perceived as a greater good, the maintenance of human dignity in the face of catastrophe. The musicians' dedication influenced other crew members and passengers. Their example of selfless service inspired acts of heroism throughout the ship. Stewards continued serving passengers, engineers remained at their posts to maintain power, and wireless operators stayed at their equipment sending distress signals. The band's music became the soundtrack for countless individual acts of courage and sacrifice. The cultural impact of the musicians' final performance extended far beyond the disaster itself. Their story became a template for how artists should respond to crisis, not by seeking personal safety, but by using their talents to serve others. This narrative resonated particularly strongly in the years following the disaster, as Europe moved toward World War I and society grappled with questions about individual responsibility and collective sacrifice. The band's instruments, lost with the ship, became symbols of artistic dedication. Music halls and concert venues across Britain and America held memorial concerts, with orchestras playing the same pieces that had echoed across the North Atlantic on that April night. Their sacrifice transformed music from entertainment into a form of moral witness, demonstrating art's power to provide meaning and comfort even in humanity's darkest hours. 20 miles away from the dying Titanic, the cargo ship SS Californian sat motionless in the ice field, her engines stopped for the night. Captain Stanley Lord had made the prudent decision to halt his vessel until daylight, avoiding the dangerous ice that had claimed the supposedly unsinkable ship. What transpired aboard the Californian during the next several hours would become one of maritime history's most contentious debates, raising questions about moral responsibility, professional duty, and the weight of decisions made in uncertainty. The Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had shut down his radio equipment at 11:30 p.m., just 10 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg. This timing wasn't coincidental. Evans had worked a long day and followed standard procedures for merchant vessels, which typically didn't maintain 24-hour radio watches. The economic realities of shipping meant that most vessels carried only one wireless operator, making continuous communication impossible. What the Californian's crew did see were mysterious lights and rockets in the distance. Third Officer Charles Groves first spotted a large steamer approaching around 11 p.m., describing it as a passenger vessel with multiple rows of lights. The ship appeared to be moving slowly, then seemed to stop. Crew members reported seeing white rockets fired from the distant vessel throughout the night. Captain Lord's response to these sightings reveals the complexity of maritime decision-making in an era before modern communication. When informed about the rockets, he inquired whether they were company signals, coloured flares used by shipping lines to communicate with their vessels. White rockets, while typically distress signals, could also be used for other purposes. Lord's caution reflected both professional conservatism and the practical realities of command in dangerous waters. The Californian's crew continued watching the mysterious vessel throughout the night. Second Officer Herbert Stone observed approximately 8 rockets fired at intervals, noting that the ship appeared to be moving away and eventually disappeared. Stone reported these observations to Captain Lord, who was resting in the chart room. The captain's responses, asking about the colour of the rockets and instructing the crew to continue monitoring, suggest a commander wrestling with incomplete information and multiple possible interpretations. The Californian's tragedy is the gap between what the crew saw and what they understood, not malice. The ship's officers were experienced mariners who had spent their careers in merchant service, where distress situations were relatively rare. Their training and experience didn't prepare them for the possibility that they were witnessing the death of 1,500 people just beyond the horizon. Captain Lord's decision to remain stationary became the focus of intense scrutiny during the British Board of Trade inquiry. Lord maintained that his ship was too far away to reach the Titanic in time, and that the vessel his crew observed was not the White Star liner, but another ship entirely. This position wasn't entirely implausible. The ice field contained multiple vessels that night, and visual identification across 20 miles of dark water presented significant challenges. The inquiry's criticism of Captain Lord reflected broader questions about professional responsibility and moral duty. Should a ship's captain risk his vessel and crew based on ambiguous signals? How much certainty is required before taking potentially dangerous action? These questions extended beyond maritime law into fundamental issues of human responsibility and the obligations we have to strangers in distress. The Californian controversy also highlighted the technological limitations of the era. The ship carried wireless equipment, but operated it intermittently. Navigation relied on dead reckoning and celestial observation. Communication between vessels depended on visual signals, flags, and Morse lamps. In this context, the failure to respond to the Titanic's distress calls wasn't necessarily negligence, but rather a consequence of technological and organizational limitations. The debate over the Californians' actions continued for decades, dividing maritime experts and historians. Some argued that Captain Lord was a scapegoat for systemic failures in maritime safety. Others maintained that his inaction represented a fundamental failure of moral courage. The controversy reflected deeper cultural tensions about individual responsibility versus institutional accountability. The case influenced maritime law and practices for generations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, adopted in 1914, mandated continuous radio watches on passenger vessels. The Californian incident became a case study in maritime academies, teaching future officers about the weight of command decisions and the importance of acting on incomplete information when lives might be at stake. Captain Lord's reputation never fully recovered from the inquiry's findings. He spent the remainder of his career defending his actions, arguing that he had followed proper procedures and made reasonable decisions based on available information. His supporters maintained that he became a scapegoat for broader failures in maritime safety regulation and ship design that had made the Titanic disaster possible. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's chief designer, walked through his creation's tilting corridors with the methodical precision of a man conducting his autopsy. At 39 years old, Andrews represented the pinnacle of naval architecture, a profession that combined artistic vision with mathematical precision. His presence aboard the ship during its maiden voyage wasn't ceremonial, but reflected his deep personal investment in every rivet, every bulkhead, and every design decision that had transformed blueprints into the largest moving object ever created by human hands. Andrews had spent 3 years perfecting the Titanic's design, working from his offices at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. His approach to ship design was revolutionary for its time, emphasizing not just size and luxury but also safety features that went beyond regulatory requirements. The ship's watertight compartments, double hull, and advanced pumping systems represented the most sophisticated maritime safety technology available in 1912. The designer's confidence in his creation wasn't mere arrogance but reflected genuine technological achievement. The Titanic incorporated innovations that would influence ship design for decades: electric lighting throughout the vessel, advanced ventilation systems, and structural engineering that distributed weight more effectively than any previous ship. Andrews had studied every maritime disaster of the previous century, incorporating lessons learned into his design. When the collision occurred, Andrews immediately understood what others couldn't accept. His ship was doomed. His intimate knowledge of the vessel's construction allowed him to calculate the flooding rate and recognize that the damage exceeded the ship's survivability threshold. The iceberg had breached 5 compartments, while the ship could survive flooding in only 4. Such an event wasn't a failure of design, but rather an impact that exceeded the disaster scenarios Andrews had planned for. The designer's actions during the ship's final hours revealed both his technical expertise and his moral character. He moved through the vessel with a blueprint in his mind, directing passengers towards safety and advising crew members on the ship's condition. His presence provided crucial technical guidance during the evacuation, helping officers understand which areas would flood first and which routes would remain passable longest. Andrew's relationship with the ship transcended professional duty. He had overseen every aspect of construction, from the selection of steel to the positioning of lifeboats. The vessel represented not just his career achievement, but also his vision of how technology could enhance human experience. The ship's grand staircase, luxurious staterooms, and innovative amenities reflected his belief that engineering should serve beauty as well as function. The tragic irony of Andrew's situation was that his design had actually performed better than regulations required. The ship's watertight compartments had functioned correctly, slowing the flooding and providing crucial time for evacuation. The electrical systems had maintained power longer than expected, keeping lights functioning and wireless equipment operational. The ship's structural integrity had held long enough to allow the launching of lifeboats, despite damage that would have sunk lesser vessels immediately. Andrew's final hours demonstrated the complex relationship between engineering confidence and human fallibility. His design had accounted for collision scenarios, fire dangers, and mechanical failures, but the specific nature of the iceberg impact, a glancing blow that opened multiple compartments simultaneously, represented a catastrophic failure mode that existing technology couldn't address. The disaster revealed the limitations of engineering hubris while simultaneously showcasing the designer's technical competence. The designer's presence aboard the ship during its maiden voyage reflected standard practice for significant vessels. Naval architects often sailed on initial crossings to observe their creations under operational conditions, making notes for future improvements. Andrews had planned to document the ship's performance, gathering data that would influence the design of the third Olympic-class vessel, the Britannic. His death represented not just personal tragedy, but the loss of invaluable technical knowledge. Andrews possessed a detailed understanding of the ship's construction, knowledge that died with him. His notes and observations about the vessel's performance during the disaster could have been vital to future ship design, but these insights were lost when he chose to remain aboard rather than seek survival. The designer's legacy extended far beyond the Titanic disaster. His innovations in ship construction influenced maritime design for decades, contributing to safer and more efficient vessels. The lessons learned from the Titanic's sinking, combined with Andrews' previous design work, helped establish new standards for maritime safety that prevented similar disasters. Andrews' story exemplifies the moral complexity of technological disaster. His design wasn't flawed, but rather faced circumstances that exceeded its intended parameters. The tragedy wasn't that he created an unsafe ship, but that he had created a vessel that, while revolutionary for its time, couldn't survive an impact that no ship of that era could have withstood. His death represented not the failure of engineering, but the limitations of human foresight in the face of unpredictable catastrophe. In the Titanic's Marconi room, two men worked frantically at equipment that represented the cutting edge of early 20th century communication technology. Jack Phillips, 25, and Harold Bride, 22, were part of an elite group of wireless operators who had mastered the complex art of Morse code transmission across vast oceanic distances. Their work that night would demonstrate both the revolutionary potential and the crucial limitations of wireless communication in its infancy. The Marconi system aboard the Titanic marked a significant advancement in maritime communication. Previous generations of ships had relied on visual signals, flags, and signal lamps, methods that worked only in clear weather and daylight hours. Wireless telegraphy promised to connect ships with shore stations and other vessels regardless of weather conditions or time of day. For the first time in maritime history, a ship in distress could summon help from hundreds of miles away. Phillips, the senior operator, had spent the day before the collision working through a massive backlog of passenger messages. The ship's wealthy passengers had discovered the novelty of sending wireless messages from mid-ocean, creating unprecedented demand for communication services. These personal messages, business correspondence, social notes, and family communications took priority over routine ship-to-ship traffic, a decision that would later prove controversial. The wireless operators worked in shifts, but the equipment required constant maintenance and adjustment. The Marconi transmitter was temperamental, requiring skilled operators who could troubleshoot technical problems while maintaining communication schedules. The apparatus filled a small room with complex machinery, including spark gap transmitters, receivers, and the emergency backup equipment that would prove crucial during the disaster. When the collision occurred, Phillips immediately began transmitting the International Distress Signal, CQD, a call that meant all stations distress. The signal was relatively new, having been adopted only 6 years earlier as ships began carrying wireless equipment. Phillips alternated between CQD and the newer SOS signal, trying to reach any ship within wireless range of the Titanic's powerful transmitter. The initial response to the distress calls was frustratingly slow. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, responded first, but her wireless operator had been about to shut down for the night. Other ships were either too far away or had already closed their wireless rooms. The Frankfurt, a German vessel, responded, but was over 150 miles distant. The technological limitation of wireless communication meant that help, while theoretically available, remained practically out of reach. Phillips' transmission technique revealed both his skill and the limitations of early wireless equipment. He had to manually adjust the transmitter's power and frequency while simultaneously operating the Morse key. The ship's electrical system, damaged by the collision, provided inconsistent power that affected transmission quality. Despite these challenges, Phillips maintained almost continuous communication with shore stations and other vessels. Harold Bride, the junior operator, worked to maintain the backup equipment and assist with message transmission. His role became increasingly crucial as the main transmitter began failing. The two men worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that their ability to communicate the ship's position and condition would determine whether rescue vessels could reach survivors in time. The wireless operator's work that night demonstrated the international nature of maritime communication. They communicated with German, British, and American vessels, coordinating rescue efforts across national boundaries. Coastal stations relayed their messages to shipping companies and government agencies, establishing a communication network spanning the Atlantic Ocean. As the ship's electrical power failed, the wireless operators switched to emergency batteries, maintaining transmission capability even as the vessel listed severely. Their dedication to maintaining communication continued until the very end. Phillips was last seen at his equipment, sending distress signals even as water flooded the wireless room. His commitment to duty ensured that rescue vessels had accurate information about the disaster's location and the number of survivors. The wireless operators' heroism extended beyond their technical skills to their decision-making under extreme pressure. They prioritized distress signals over personal safety, recognizing that their ability to communicate with potential rescue vessels represented the difference between life and death for hundreds of survivors. Their actions demonstrated how technology could amplify human courage and determination. Bride's survival provided crucial testimony about the disaster's final hours. His account of the wireless room's operations, the sequence of distress calls, and the responses from other vessels became essential evidence in subsequent investigations. His testimony helped establish the timeline of events and identified both the heroes and the failures in the maritime communication system. The wireless operator's story illustrated the paradox of technological progress, advanced communication systems that could reach across thousands of miles, but remained dependent on human operators who worked limited hours and followed commercial rather than safety priorities. Their heroism highlighted both the potential and the limitations of early 20th century technology, foreshadowing the communication systems that would eventually make such disasters impossible. In the depths of the Titanic's third-class compartments, hundreds of immigrants carried more than just luggage. They transported dreams, hopes, and the accumulated savings of entire families who had invested everything in passage to America. These passengers, often overlooked in accounts that focus on wealthy first-class victims, represented the human tide of early 20th century immigration that would reshape American society. Their stories reveal the complex motivations, expectations, and tragedies that defined the immigrant experience. The ship's third-class accommodations, while basic by the standards of first-class luxury, represented significant improvements over typical steerage conditions. The White Star Line had designed these spaces to attract immigrants willing to pay premium prices for better treatment during the Atlantic crossing. Private cabins, electric lighting, and improved ventilation systems made the Titanic's third-class passage more comfortable than the crowded dormitories common on other vessels. Among the third-class passengers were families who had sold farms, businesses, and family possessions to finance their journey. The Sage family from England travelled with 11 members, including 9 children, seeking agricultural opportunities in the American West. Their decision to emigrate reflected not desperation but calculated optimism about America's expanding economy and the opportunities it offered for skilled workers and entrepreneurs. The linguistic diversity of third-class passengers created a complex social dynamic aboard the ship. Italian stonemasons, Swedish farmers, Irish labourers, and Lebanese merchants shared dining rooms and social spaces, creating temporary communities that bridged cultural and national boundaries. These interactions provided glimpses of the multicultural society that America was becoming, as immigrants learned to navigate cultural differences while maintaining their distinct identities. Many third-class passengers carried documents that represented their life's achievements, apprenticeship certificates, letters of recommendation, and family records that would establish their credibility in America. These papers, carefully preserved through the Atlantic crossing, would have enabled immigrants to find employment and establish themselves in their new country. The loss of these documents in the disaster represented not just personal tragedy, but the erasure of human capital that could have contributed to American economic development. The social dynamics of third-class passengers during the disaster revealed both the limitations and the humanity of early 20th century social hierarchies. While barriers existed between passenger classes, emergency conditions broke down some of these distinctions. Crew members directed third-class passengers toward lifeboats, and some survived alongside wealthy first-class passengers. However, the ship's design and evacuation procedures still reflected class-based assumptions about passenger priority. The immigrants' responses to the disaster varied based on their cultural backgrounds and previous experiences. Scandinavian passengers, familiar with maritime travel, often understood the gravity of the situation more quickly than those from landlocked regions. Italian and Lebanese passengers, accustomed to extended family networks, often stayed together as groups, sometimes hindering evacuation efforts but providing emotional support during the crisis. The economic impact of the disaster on immigrant communities extended far beyond the immediate victims. Relatives already in America had sponsored many passengers, providing passage money and guaranteeing employment. The loss of these immigrants disrupted carefully planned family reunifications and economic strategies that had taken years to develop. Entire communities in America mourned relatives they had never met, but had eagerly anticipated welcoming. The survival stories of third-class passengers often demonstrated resourcefulness and determination that reflected their immigrant experience. These were people accustomed to overcoming obstacles, navigating bureaucratic systems, and adapting to unfamiliar environments. Their ability to survive the disaster often depended on skills they had developed during their journey to America: language abilities, cultural adaptability, and the capacity to make quick decisions under pressure. The tragedy also revealed the vulnerability of immigrant communities to disasters that affected transportation systems. Unlike wealthy passengers who could afford multiple attempts at ocean crossing, many third-class passengers had invested their life savings in a single journey. The disaster's impact on these families was therefore catastrophic, eliminating not just lives, but the economic foundations that had made immigration possible. The cultural memory of the disaster varied significantly among different immigrant communities. Italian Americans, Scandinavian Americans, and other ethnic groups created their own narratives about the tragedy, often emphasizing the courage and sacrifice of their compatriots. These stories became part of the broader immigrant experience, demonstrating how newcomers to America had faced and overcome extraordinary challenges. The loss of third-class passengers represented more than individual tragedy. It symbolized the interruption of America's Great Immigration Wave. Each victim had represented potential contributions to American society: skilled craftsmen, ambitious entrepreneurs, and young families who would have strengthened the nation's economic and cultural foundation. Their deaths reminded the world that the promise of America remained vulnerable to the same natural and technological forces that affected all humanity. The RMS Carpathia, sailing from New York to the Mediterranean, received the Titanic's distress signal at 12:35 a.m. on April 15, 1912. Captain Arthur Rostron's immediate response would transform him from an obscure merchant captain into a maritime hero, demonstrating how individual leadership can triumph over impossible circumstances. His ship's race through the ice fields to reach the disaster site became one of the most dramatic rescue operations in maritime history. Captain Rostron faced an extraordinary challenge when wireless operator Harold Cottam brought him the Titanic's distress message. The Carpathia was 58 miles away, travelling at her normal speed of 14 knots. To reach the disaster site before survivors succumbed to hypothermia, Rostron would need to push his ship beyond its design limits, while navigating the same ice field that had destroyed the unsinkable Titanic. His decision to attempt the rescue required both technical expertise and moral courage. The Carpathia's crew responded to Rostron's emergency orders with remarkable efficiency. Engineers pushed the ship's engines to 17 knots, a speed that strained every component of the vessel's propulsion system. Additional stokers fed the furnaces, creating steam pressure that exceeded normal operating parameters. The ship's medical staff prepared for mass casualties, setting up treatment areas and gathering supplies for hundreds of potential survivors. Rostron's navigation through the ice field demonstrated masterful seamanship. He positioned extra lookouts, increased lighting, and personally directed the ship's course through waters that had claimed the world's largest passenger vessel just hours earlier. The captain's ability to maintain maximum speed while avoiding ice required constant adjustments and split-second decisions that could have resulted in a second maritime disaster. The Carpathia's wireless operator maintained continuous communication with other vessels, coordinating rescue efforts and providing updates on the ship's progress. This communication network enabled other vessels to adjust their courses and assist in the rescue operation. The Frankfurt, Olympic and other ships altered their routes to provide backup assistance, creating an impromptu maritime rescue fleet. When the Carpathia reached the disaster site at 3:30 a.m, the crew faced the horrifying reality of the Atlantic's deadliest peacetime maritime disaster. The ship's crew had prepared for hundreds of survivors, but they found only 705 people in 20 lifeboats, scattered across miles of debris-filled ocean. The water temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit had killed most of those who had entered the water, leaving floating corpses and debris as the only evidence of the Titanic's 2,224 passengers and crew. The rescue operation required precise coordination and emotional strength. Carpathia's crew lowered rope ladders and rigged pulley systems to bring survivors aboard. Many passengers were suffering from hypothermia and required immediate medical attention. Overwhelming the ship's limited medical facilities, crew members prioritized providing basic care to the most seriously injured survivors. The Carpathia's passengers, originally bound for Mediterranean vacations, immediately opened their cabins and personal belongings to Titanic survivors. This spontaneous generosity demonstrated the human capacity for compassion during crisis. Passengers shared clothing, food and personal items with survivors who had lost everything. The ship's dining rooms became refugee centres, providing warmth and comfort to people who had experienced unimaginable trauma. Captain Rostron's decisions during the rescue operation revealed both his humanitarian instincts and his practical understanding of maritime law. He ordered the recovery of bodies floating in the water, recognising the importance of providing closure to families and gathering evidence for future investigations. The ship's crew also collected debris that might provide clues about the disaster's cause, preserving evidence that would prove crucial in subsequent inquiries. The return journey to New York became a period of mourning and reflection. Survivors began processing their experiences, sharing stories that would become the foundation of historical accounts. The ship's wireless operator worked continuously, sending survivor lists to anxious relatives and providing updates to news organizations. These communications created the first detailed accounts of the disaster, shaping public understanding of the tragedy. The Carpathia's arrival in New York Harbor on April 18th marked the beginning of the disaster's aftermath. Thousands of people gathered at the docks, seeking information about relatives and friends. The ship's passengers and crew had become unwilling participants in one of history's most significant news events, their actions scrutinized by investigators, journalists, and the public. The rescue operation's success resulted from the convergence of individual heroism, technological capability, and maritime tradition. Captain Rostron's leadership, his crew's dedication, and the ship's mechanical reliability enabled the rescue of 705 survivors who would have died without intervention. Their actions demonstrated the triumph of human courage and technical competence over natural forces, even in the face of unprecedented disaster. The Carpathia's role in the Titanic rescue became a template for maritime emergency response. The ship's crew had improvised solutions to unprecedented challenges, creating procedures that would influence rescue operations for decades. Their experience demonstrated the importance of preparation, leadership, and international cooperation in responding to maritime disasters. The rescue operation's psychological impact on the Carpathia's crew and passengers extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Many participants in the rescue suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, haunted by the scenes of death and suffering they had witnessed. Their sacrifice, the interruption of their journeys to save strangers, exemplified the maritime tradition of mutual assistance that remains fundamental to ocean travel. The story of the Carpathia's rescue mission ultimately became a testament to human resilience and the power of individual action in the face of catastrophe. Captain Rostrom's decision to risk his ship and crew to save Titanic survivors demonstrated that heroes emerge not from extraordinary circumstances, but from ordinary people who choose to act with courage when confronted with human suffering.